Hello. Looks like it's working. Great. All right, so this next section, where are we? We're actually not even yet a halfway through the actual writing that he did. Obviously, once you get into adolescence and adulthood and life stories in New York City and burgeoning gay society and all those sort of things, the tale becomes much longer. So this is still the middle of 1966, and this section is called Falling Down the Rabbit Hole. One morning that summer, I was having my 39-cent breakfast in a corner coffee shop at 3rd Avenue on 60th Street. The very same coffee shop that Miss Twiggy, the then famous British fashion model, appeared one morning to do a photo shoot while I was there having my breakfast. And this obviously queer gay had not yet come into general use yet. Guys said to one another, "I suppose I'll see you at the Old Vic tonight." I remembered that I often passed a little hole in the wall of a bar on 60th Street on my way to Our Lady of the Perpetual Help Church further down the same block. I often went to that church for Mass or novena devotions in honor of Our Lady. Not long afterwards, at the end of a night at the singles bar with the girls, and having had quite a few scotch and sodas under my belt, I made up my mind to check out the Old Vic. I entered into a long, narrow, dark space with the bar along one wall. I got a drink, just what I needed, and made my way back through the packed crowd of mostly men to the back. The room opened up to a square space which was a crowded dance floor with music playing from the jukebox. As my eyes adjusted and focused in the dim smoke-filled air, I realized that it was almost all men, and they were dancing with each other. I then realized that one of the guys from the singles bar, and he saw me. He came over and he said, "I'd always dreamed you'd turn up here. You're so cute, you know." I blushed, and then he asked me to dance. I stammered and declined politely, and at that, I sobered up on the spot. He introduced himself as George, and continued to talk with me, realizing that I was indeed a novice, and here for my very first time. I did not find him at all attractive, but he was friendly and had become my self-appointed guide in my journey through Wonderland. I felt like Alice, as I had fallen down the rabbit hole to find a whole other world lying just beneath the real world I had always known. George and I met up on my subsequent forays down the rabbit hole, and he soon was inviting me to accompany him to dinners and soirees in the Upper East Side apartments of his acquaintances. Despite my working-class origins, the one thing that stood me well now was having been taught good manners. I was a close study as to which fork to pick up and when, and figured out that the only way anyone would find out how much I did not know is if I opened my mouth and told them. These first introductions were pretty sophisticated artists, writers, and musicians, and I was fascinated to listen to their conversation, at which I would nod, smile, and flash my eyes when appropriate. Meanwhile, I saw Bernadette less frequently. During one conversation in her bedroom, as she was getting ready to go out that autumn evening, she told me that since her mother's death, she could not endure living at home with her father, and that Ray, the older brother of one of our classmates, who was a young widower, had asked her to be engaged to him. I was stunned, but replied that maybe it was for the best, because even though I loved her, I was not able to offer her an alternate plan. As I left her house on Adelaide Street, that evening the tears streamed down my face in the dark, as I thought that if I loved her less, I would have asked her to marry me, but I indeed loved her too much to drag her down my uncertain future. Later that autumn, I was temporarily laid off from my job because things were slow. As the rough New York winter lay ahead and my health was going downhill again, I decided to spend the next few months in Florida. My Aunt Madeline had been going to St. Petersburg with her neighbor Gertrude. I had on one occasion joined them down there, so I was familiar with the place. Just before they were to go, around Thanksgiving, Gertrude became ill, so the plan was that I would spend the winter there with my aunt in the place they had already rented. I headed down by train ahead of her so that I could stop and see Paul, who had now been drafted into the Army and stationed at Fort Benning, Georgia. While there, word came that Aunt Madeline had a stroke and would not be going anywhere. Just a week before that unfortunate incident, my dear Aunt Alice had got the results back from some tests she had done, and the news was not good. She had rather advanced ovarian cancer. She was holding the devastating news to herself until Madeline was off on the train to Florida. I arrived in St. Pete and was told that they would not let me, a 19-year-old, alone, occupy the place that they had rented. My funds were in a bank check, and I was informed that there would be a 10-day hold on the money. Now I was homeless and almost penniless in a strange place. The only thing I could think to do was to call at the rectory of St. Mary's, the Roman Catholic Church downtown. After my previous experience, I was a bit reluctant to do this, but my choices were not myriad. The priest, a wispy Irishman, listened to my tale of woe and was sympathetic. He knew two old ladies in his parish who sometimes lent out a room and their house, and he said he would vouch for the rent until my check cleared. He called them and they agreed, so now I, at least, had a roof over my head. I think he also advanced me some money to eat on for the next week or so. The two old ladies were characters straight out of an old black-and-white 1930s movie. They were originally from a place called Cherry Hill, New Jersey, and listened to Mario Lanza recordings every evening. One was in her 90s and bedridden. The other was a 70-something widowed daughter-in-law who took care of her. Now their household was complete with a 19-year-old, confused and ailing boy from New York. As Christmas drew near, I was amazed at the poinsettias that grew wild, the size of a house, and also the tacky Santa with sled and reindeers, complete with fake snow that was sprawled out between the beautiful palm trees on the city green. I managed to give my two old ladies each something for Christmas, and I was surprised that they had a Zippo lighter engraved for me with my initials. As New Year's 1967 rolled around, they grew fond of me even though they worried about me whenever I was out. 1967. Somewhere in all this, I met a quiet, nice-looking 42-year-old man with silver-gray hair named Jim. We liked to walk along the waterfront downtown and talk of all kinds of things. Sometimes he would ask me to join him for a meal or take me out on a drive out to the country. We even took a trip to the Ringling Brothers Circus Museum in Sarasota and another museum that had some remarkable European paintings. He might have once been married. Just about everyone I met was. But now he was single. Jim had an air conditioning business and was moving into a nice duplex townhouse when I met him. Everything was fine until he invited me over one Sunday and sat me down to tell me that he wanted to pay my tuition to college and that I could live there in the new place with him rent-free. He was crushed and confused when I politely but firmly said, "No, thank you," and never saw him again there. I may have been living on edge, but I was fiercely independent and not cut out to be a kept boy. Just to fill you in, Evo, this is a memoir that a friend of mine wrote when he was ill, and it's about his youth in New York City as a gay man and a religious man. Right. Some years later, I happened to run into him in New York City on a cold, rainy night, and over dinner in the Oak Room at the Plaza Hotel, where he was staying on his trip, we talked about that incident, and I gently let him know that the problem was me, not him. We never saw each other again after that. As spring approached, I would soon be going north to what? I did not know. I received a letter back from Bernadette in which she told me that she and Ray had gotten married. I just sat there in my room holding the letter in my hand and staring blankly for what seemed like eternity. Then I began to cry, that hopeless sort of crying as when someone has died and there is no going back, nor forward either. It seems like I sat there crying for 2 or 3 days. Everything Bernadette and I had between us was now over for good. She was married to someone else, and I could not go back and just be good friends. It just would not be honest, given the way I had felt about her ever since we were 16 years old. But that was not the only dream on that day that died. The part of me that still clung to any hope of having a normal life, of being like other men with a wife and a family, had now died forever. I was numb. I never thought of suicide, but I tried to fantasize being thought of as dead and just starting all over with no past. The only problem was that it would still be the same sad, confused me as long as I had any memory at all. I would carry my loss. But I still had God, and at that point was able to keep all I had to keep me going. At that point, that was all that I had to keep me going. As the winter 1967 was winding to a gentle close in St. Pete, I took the train back to the still cold and bleak New York City landscape. I resumed living at home in Floral Park and got back in touch with a few old friends and acquaintances, including Andrea. It was probably a subconscious calculation, but I figured she might have some news about Bernadette, and she did. According to her, Bernadette and Ray still frequented a Queens night spot that she and I used to go to, and where she occasionally worked as a go-go dancer in a yellow crepe dress that I had made for her. Never needing to wait to be asked out, Andrea suggested that she and I go there on Friday night and see who turns up. That was more a scheme than mere coincidence, I guessed. The place was small, dimly lighted, and crowded when we arrived. Soon enough, I caught sight of Bernadette, and she saw me, and our eyes locked. Suddenly it seemed that the room was empty save the two of us. A whole wave of emotion came over me with all the familiar longing inside. At some point the four of us got seated at a table together, and I was introduced to Ray, a nice enough-looking Italian-American with premature graying, wavy hair. Things went smooth enough between Ray and I, as he just thought of me as Andrea's date. Bernadette and I were soon in touch, and the next thing I remember, we were meeting for lunch at the apartment she and Ray rented somewhere in Queens. It was decidedly uncomfortable for me there. Even though we still had the same intense feelings for each other, I was, nevertheless, alone with another man's wife in his home. That autumn, things had picked up at JM Hall, and I got my old job back. My back was turned now on Floral Park and all the heartbreak. I stayed in Manhattan from Sunday evening to Friday, renting a room by the week at the Vanderbilt YMCA, otherwise known as the Railroad Y, on East 47th Street, across from Grand Central Station. I was still so naive that I had no idea what all the male Ys were famous for. But of the three in Manhattan, the Railroad Y was the least notorious. The rooms were Spartan, almost monastic, with a single bed, a small writing table, and a straight-back chair. I got up early each morning, took a brief shower in the common washroom, dressed in my dark gray suit, and walked up to work. Most mornings I would stop at St. Patrick's Cathedral, entering the rear door on Madison Avenue. Often I would offer myself to serve one of the many private masses said by the resident cathedral clergy at the small side altars. I had figured that a hot lunch was more economical as my main meal. In the evening, when dinner prices prevailed, I would make do with just a deli sandwich or some cold cuts. That way I could save a few dollars left to get a drink or two in the evening before I went back to my little Stark room at night. 1968. The dashing John Lindsay was New York's mayor for 2 years now, and things were starting to loosen up for the city's underground sexual minority. It seemed every week another gay, or a new word in my lexicon, bar was opening somewhere in New York City. And to attract a clientele on weeknights, there was a free buffet, and maybe even a free extra drink at one of them. I soon had worked out a schedule for the whole week. It was not all free of peril, though. An innocent conversation at a bar or on a certain street could find you in handcuffs downtown facing charges of soliciting an undercover police officer for unnatural sex, and then the policeman's absent partner would materialize and corroborate the accusation. Then there was prostitution. Certain streets were known, to everyone else in New York City except for me, for meeting male hustlers, another new word in my growing lexicon. I remember innocently wandering into one such situation around 3rd Avenue and 51st Street, and catching the hard looks of these other young men who thought I was competing and cutting into their territory. I never quite fathomed prostitution. The fact that men paid women for sex was known to me, Why they would want to do that, I did not quite grasp, but it was none of my concern either. What really confused me, though, was why older men were expected to pay younger ones for the pleasure of their company. From my perspective, the mature gentlemen had so much more to offer than the youngsters in terms of wisdom, experience, and presence, that the monetary exchange should have been the other way around. But that's just another example of how a left-handed person might think. There was so much that I cannot yet understand, so I would mask my vulnerability with a tough exterior. But all of life was a learning experience, and one evening a distinguished-looking, bald-headed gentleman walked alongside me for a bit, and then tried to strike up a conversation. My responses were the one-word variety, and we got to the corner. He finally asked, "Are you out hustling tonight?" Now, to me, the word hustling meant to be in a hurry, or in lower circles, to play pool for money, neither of which applied at the moment. Not knowing what was going on, I shrugged my hunched shoulders and grunted, "Well, what do you think?" Thinking that I was smart enough to dodge a vice cop by my non-answer, he paused and wrote something on a scrap of paper, folded it around something, and then slipped it into my coat pocket. He said, "I live around here, and I'd like you to stop by this evening. Give me a call, okay?" As he walked on ahead, I looked at the paper to see what his name was. Names always interested me. When I saw the two crisp 20s, the penny dropped, as the British say. I hurriedly caught up with him and thrust his offerings back at him, then stormed off furious and indignant. That he dared to think that I was for sale was the height of outrage to me, even though $40 was the better part of my weekly take-home pay. On one evening, out in search of a free meal and a drink, or two, I walked into a new bar called Harry's back east on 3rd Ave and 83rd Street. I stepped up to the bar to order, and before I caught the bartender's eye, a guy moved in next to me, put his drink down on the bar, and said to me, "Can I buy you a drink, kid?" Whereas I liked guys who were older than me, I could not bear being called kid or otherwise being condescended to. Without looking up at him, I spit out, "I don't come in here unless I can buy my own drinks." With that, I sat down on one of the chairs clustered around the little tables along the wall opposite the bar. I kept my eye on him. Not too bad, I thought. After a decent interval, he came over, and, less cocky now, asked, "Mind if I sit here?" I shrugged. "Do what you like, I don't own the furniture." He retreated for a bit and eventually came over and sat down at my table, saying nothing. We sat there silently until I inquired, "So how's your evening going?" As if I did not know already. Well, we got talking, and he offered his hand, and he said his name was Louis. We shook hands, and I allowed that I was Leo. Louis and Leo, I mused to myself. Sounds good. We agreed to see each other again, but I don't remember how we did that, since I had no phone number of my own, and he did not offer his. I had learned that usually meant a married guy on the sly, which was often the case with the guys I found interesting. But we did manage to see each other again, and he hesitatingly told me he was 34, a bit young for my taste then, but worth the exception, and that he taught at a vocational school, sometimes evening classes. He drove into the city from Sullivan County, one of the northern suburbs, and yes, he was married, had 4 children, 3 girls, and the youngest, a boy. The problem arose as to where we could be alone, as if I was still staying at the Y, which arrangement he really did not like. He seemed to know more about what might be going on there than I did, and I could already tell he was the jealous type. Louis seemed to know the hotels that did not ask a lot of questions, so we had a few Friday evening rendezvous. Then on April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. Riots broke out in over 100 cities across America. New York City had experienced catastrophic damage in 1964, which had nearly destroyed Harlem, one of the largely African-American neighborhoods of the city. In anticipation of a repeat of this, and fearing that the damage would be inflicted on the prosperous Midtown area, all of New York City's police were ordered into uniform and on the streets. By then, Louis had told me that he was a New York City police sergeant, and that the vocational school he taught at was, in fact, the police academy. This emergency meant that Louis was posted with a squadron of police officers to monitor the area around 5th Avenue and 50th Street. He told me where he would be so I could meet up with him when he was on break. So I did. And there he was on that chilly spring evening, all dressed in his uniform, which I had never seen him in before. I remember how odd he looked to me. The bulky woolen overcoat and the oversized sergeant's cap made him look lost in all of it. Even tough friends of mine thought of this as some kind of fantasy or fetish thing. It did not do a thing for me. He looked much better without all that. I became more determined to find my own apartment, but I was not yet 21, the legal age in New York to sign a lease. In early April, I found a newspaper ad for a studio at $80 per month, a bit over my price range, on East 96th Street and Lexington Ave, just beyond the northern edge of civilization, on the now popular Upper East Side. It was being rented by a Mrs. Bernardi's real estate office on Lexington Avenue in the 90s. Louis suggested that I skip shaving the morning we were going to meet Mrs. Bernardi, so I would look a bit older. He told me to keep quiet, and he would do the talking. The story was that I was his wife's young cousin, and that he was in it to look out after the kid. Of course, I did not like any of that, but agreed, knowing I was in fact underage and I wanted that apartment. As it happened, Mrs. Bernardi, now well past middle age, had an eye for my appealing young cop friend. I liked the studio, and the more Mrs. Bernardi batted her false eyelashes at him, the sooner I felt this deal would be signed by noon. By lunch, I had the keys to my first apartment, and I slept there that very night on an old mattress that was on the floor. I would live at 161 East 96th Street, apartment 2D, for some 7 years. The apartment was in an 1890s tenement building that originally had 2 floor-through flats on each of the 4 floors. The building had been extensively redone in the 1940s, creating 4 studio apartments on each floor to increase the housing stock during the war. The rear units, like the ones I had, were a little smaller than the front ones. Once you undid the several locks, you entered into a narrow hallway, off of which was a small but complete bathroom that even had a window. Next was the little kitchen, with a window that opened onto the air well, across which you could practically reach over for the sugar bowl on the table of the apartment in the next building. The end of the hallway led to a main room, which was around 11 feet wide and about 16 feet deep. There were 2 tall windows on the rear wall that looked out on a rather untidy backyard, and the backs of the buildings on 97th Street. All the original moldings and details had been stripped off in the renovation, except the mantel and the bookcases around the wood-burning fireplace. It had just been given a fresh coat of cheap white paint, and the wood floors were in decent shape. It seems that the place was pretty well outfitted in a few days. Louis brought in a few pieces from his folks' extra things in the Bronx, including a clever console table that opened out to seat 8. I had collected and restored, just for this purpose, some basic pieces of furniture that I kept stored at home in Floral Park, along with some pots and pans and old dishes from Aunt Margaret. On May 21st, I celebrated my 21st birthday in my new home with Louis and a few new friends. That joy was soon eclipsed by the news that my dear Aunt Alice's condition was deteriorating rapidly. She had just been moved from Aunt Margaret's in Floral Park to St. Rose's home on the Lower East Side that was run by Dominican sisters, specifically for incurable cancer patients. I remember that the first time I entered the facility, in spite of the heavy air of antiseptics, the smell of cancer was overwhelming. I hardly recognized my aunt now. In such a short time, she had wasted away to a frail being wrapped in voluminous white hospital sheets. One of the nursing sisters was kneeling next to her, trying to get a little liquid into her shriveled mouth. My godmother, Alice Laura Tyson, died, aged 63, on July 2nd, 1968. A solemn high requiem mass was offered for her at St. Hedwig's in Floral Park. In our parish church, crowded with family, friends, and neighbors, We mourned dear Aunt Alice to the familiar strains of the ancient Latin rituals that my brothers and I had served so many times before. This was the beginning of liturgical renewal, and by this point only the scripture readings of the Mass were read in English. This was the last truly dignified funeral Mass I had attended for a member of my family. On a warm, sunny summer day, Aunt Alice was buried in the Tyson family plot at St. John's Catholic Cemetery in Queens. As her casket was obscured by the earth, a light was extinguished within me. But the lingering glow of her love abided within me always. Until this time, I had been very discreet with my younger brother James about my newfound lifestyle. If he had said anything to my father and mother about my relationship with Louis, and they got upset, my parents could have brought charges against Louis until I was fully of legal age at the age of 21. This would have brought down his career in the police department, ended his marriage and relationship with his family, and probably resulted in his suicide, as that was considered the only honorable thing to do in those days in that situation. At least that way his wife and family would have his pension to live on, whereas if he was fired for being gay and was alive, there would be nothing. It was already known in his family that his younger scholarly brother Joseph was living with his childhood sweetheart, Frankie, a butch painter and wallpaper hanger. But now that I was over 21, I carefully planned what I would say to James, so as not to hurt or upset his delicate sensibility. One Sunday afternoon, when he was visiting my apartment, I delivered the carefully scripted presentation, and when I came to the final period, he responded rather casually, "Oh, you too." When I wondered at loud that he had not caught on since I did not hide my life and friends, he replied, "Well, I figured since you did not hide, you must not yourself be that way. You just can't win for losing." So now we had 2 out of the 3 in the family, and even though James and I were different in many ways, we were able to draw closer. I don't know if I read that in a way that made it clear, but he found out his brother James was gay as well. And there were lots of stories I heard about that. Sometime that summer, Doris, Louis's German wife up in Sullivan County, who knew but did not approve of her husband's proclivities, had figured out that there was someone new in his life, and through him extended an invitation for me to visit. With some trepidation, I accepted and went up to his home for the meeting. Doris greeted me at the front door, smiled a nervous smile, and invited me in. She immediately pulled Louis into the kitchen, where she thought she was out of earshot, and said to him sternly, "How much is that costing us?" I still looked much younger than my 21 years, a fact that I really disliked, and she mistook me for a kept boy. He assured her that I was completely self-supporting. Doris soon sent Louis out to pick up one of the children, so she could have a little talk with me over coffee at her kitchen table. Wasting no time, she laid her cards on the table, and I solemnly assured her that I respected his obligations to her and their 4 children, and that, as she wished, he was to be home every night and on weekends, unless previously agreed to by her. As far as I know, I never broke my promise to her. With time, Doris came to trust me. When her aged mother, older brother, and his attractive younger wife visited from Germany, she accepted my invitation for her and her family to stop by for coffee and cake at my apartment after they all had dinner in one of the German restaurants on East 86th Street. For that occasion, I did put away the framed photo of Louis that usually stood on the mantel. My previous attempt at a relationship with Bernadette was hardly the formula for eternal bliss, but the dynamic between men is very different than between woman and man, and I had no idea what I was doing or supposed to be doing. Louis, I guess, was pretty much head over heels for me, and I was quite captivated by him, but I had not planned on getting into a relation at that or any time. I was still bruised by my first experience and was pretty numb when it came to falling in love with anyone. Louis once said that I marched to the beat of a different drum, It did not take me long to discover that his idea of love came with all the possessiveness and jealousy that drove me up a wall. His Italian opera approach to a relationship was met with my cold, Teutonic silence. I had heard that he gave the look of death to anyone who so much as took a second glance at me. One evening at a party with friends on the Upper East Side, Louis and I were sitting together on a sofa, and a fellow sat down on the other side of me. He put his arm on the back of the sofa and let his hand slip down to my shoulder just as I was turning to Louis to say something. It was then that I caught that dreaded look aimed at the other fellow, as Louis said to him in a bone-chilling voice, "Move that arm or I'll break it off for you." Nuts, anyone? As the famous line goes from Auntie Mame. By then, the company I had worked for, J.M. Hall, Inc., had been sold to another church goods firm, C.M. Almy & Son, on 5th Avenue and 47th Street, and we, the employees, were sold along with it. I became friendly with a woman my age from England, Vera, who worked there, and we used to go out occasionally for drinks or a bite to eat when Louis was at home with Doris and the little ones. I do not know what her initial interest in me was, but being English, she soon figured out that I was not the marrying kind. Nevertheless, Louis warned me about her and got all worked up, especially if I had invited her over to my place. It did strike me that there was indeed a bit of irony in all that. Then there was Lenora, the well-dressed, middle-aged secretary who lived up on the 4th floor front studio of my building. She always chatted with me when we passed on the stairs, and of course, I was sternly warned by Louis about her and what she was up to. One rainy Sunday afternoon, she invited me up to her apartment for a martini or two. As 2 became 3 or 4, I said I had to get going, because Louis would be stopping by for a while before the late shift. Before I knew it, I was flat on the sofa with my clothes being undone. Some of the buttons popped off completely. I did manage to extricate myself, as always, and as far as women were concerned, with my virtue intact. Buttoning what I could, I made my way down the stairs towards my apartment, hoping not to run into anyone, and just as I approached, clutching my disheveled clothing, Louis came up the stairs to my door. Early. The look I got I'll never forget. At first nothing was said. Then just, "See? See what I told you?" as he was wagging his finger at me. I hated it when he was right. I got to know his friends, Freddie the cop, and his younger partner, George. Sheila, an attractive young blonde, who was one of the first women police officers on the force, and her older Jewish lover, Terry, and Louis's cousin's husband, Jerry, who was a cadet at the police academy. My favorite, though, was Bill Joyce, who was Louis's best friend. He was about 8 years Louis's senior, and had once been a teacher at the Christian Brothers, a Roman Catholic religious order. Bill had a special liking for me of the paternal kind, and took me under his wing. This was no problem to Louis, as Bill preferred older guys, the fireman or the garbage collector type. If Louis was in one of his jealous moods, he would call Bill and lay out his suspicions about what I might have been up to over a weekend when he was at home in Sullivan County. Bill would promptly call me at work and clue me in to what charges I was likely to face when I got home and was confronted by Louis. That way I would have a chance to get my testimony straight. While I was on my way home, Louis would be there going through the trash, looking for strange cigarette butts and checking the closet to see what clothes I had worn recently. I often thought if he had been a detective, New York City would have had no unsolved murders in its books. In spite of all this, I continued to make interesting new friends. In the course of shopping and social comings and goings around my Upper East Side territory, I would cross paths with many different kinds of people. Of course, I had no way to know that they would become a regular in that phase of my life, so by the time they did, I would be unclear as to how or through whom we originally met. One that comes to mind is Bill Wright, a nice-looking 40-something writer and socialite who was a Yale graduate. He lived a few blocks south of me in the lower 90s. He wrote books mostly about society folk, and he had an array of intriguing tales to allow. Since he had no set work schedule, I could call on him on short notice and just drop around for a drink and some talk. I found him to be interesting company. Bill lived in a handsome pre-World War I building and had a rather traditional, tastefully decorated two-bedroom apartment, a pleasant space for me to spend an afternoon or evening. Sometimes he would then be off to play with bridge partners with Tallulah Bankhead. He would then be off to be bridge partners with Tallulah Bankhead. Because I resided on the north side of 96th Street, the upper boundary of the Upper East Side, that put me beyond the pale in a forbidden region known as Spanish Harlem. I was sometimes teased with the then popular song, "There is a rose in Spanish Harlem," not so subtly implying that I was the rose. Getting proper society to cross the border for an evening took some doing, but I never felt beset by the poverty of my dwelling or its location, so I had no compunction inviting Bill up for dinner and to meet my friend Louis. The challenge was Louis's jealous disposition. To get around that, I'd have to imply a history that predated my knowing Louis. That evening started off smoothly until we sat down at the table to eat. Louis took off his suit coat, got comfortable, looked Bill straight in the eye and said, "So the kid tells me that you two have known each other for a while." As he was saying this, he casually slipped his service revolver out of his shoulder holster and silently laid it on the candle-lit table. Bill never missed a beat in the conversation as I served a particularly delicious coq au vin, after which we had an otherwise uneventful evening. The next day, Bill admitted that in spite of his numerous theatrical experiences on stage at Yale, he would always count this the performance of and for his life. Another character who was to become a fixture in my life at that time was Dan Landy, a rather handsome fellow who originally hailed from an Italian-American family in Queens. Again, I cannot now remember how I first knew Dan, but he lived in the extended neighborhood on East 71st Street, and a few blocks closer to the East River than I did. Dan was quite a production, deliberately looking considerably younger than his actual age, which I never really knew. He always appeared stylishly dressed, fastidiously groomed, with flashy eyes and rather animated gestures, and an over-the-top personality. He loved to travel the world and lived by his wits. Wherever he was or wherever he was going, there was always to be some clever money-making angle involved. Dan was a good photographer, so if he was in South America, Eastern Europe, or some island somewhere, he would shoot hundreds of pictures of things his instinct told him were of interest. When he got back to New York, he would file his work with a few well-placed photo agencies, and if one of his shots was selected to illustrate a magazine article or a news publication, he got a handsome check. One incident that I remember was an earthquake in Peru, and he had just filed photos of the area from his recent trip. That's how it worked before worldwide digital image transmission. Once he came back from North Africa with a shipment of caftans, which were all the rage in New York fashion circles. He drafted me into aiding him in marketing these to the Upper East Side boutiques. In between, Dan would be involved in interior decorating jobs for bored but wealthy mafia housewives in the Bronx, or doing holiday department store windows in Harlem. To avoid the worst of the New York winter, Dan would lease a sizable hacienda in Acapulco and then rent out rooms to freezing Canadians and Americans of a certain persuasion. When he was on the road, I would dutifully collect the mail from his apartment and rent checks from his sublet tenant. Dan's stated opinion about my religious proclivities was, "I suppose gladiolas and organ music once a week won't actually hurt anyone." He was fun to hang around with, as I never knew what would be next. One evening on our way from a walk, we popped into a tiny gay piano bar called Uncle Charlie's on Lexington at 73rd Street for a nightcap. We sometimes concluded our outings there, as it was the point where we parted to go our separate ways home. That particular night, as we were finishing our drinks, at seats around the piano, and getting ready to leave, in came a whole group of people accompanying the legendary jazz pianist and singer, a favorite of mine, Nina Simone, who was out celebrating her birthday. She politely asked the fellow who had been playing all night if he would mind her taking over and entertaining her friends. We were there until 4 a.m., closing time. What I felt like the next day at work, I have no idea now, but I'll remember that night for the rest of my life. Sometime that summer, Louis got the green light from Doris for he and I go out to Fire Island, an oversized sandbar along the southern shore of Long Island. And the several little vacation communities that were out there, like Pearls along the sandy strip, was one that I had heard of even before I had come out. Cherry Grove. It was legendary as a gay haunt long before the term gay was in general use. The usual means of transportation was the Long Island Railroad, but since Louis had a car, we drove out from Manhattan to a sleepy South Shore town called Sayville, where we and all the train's passengers caught a ferry across to Cherry Grove. The scene at the ferry terminal was sort of a cross between the hordes of huddled masses arriving in Ellis Island and the parade of the Munchkins in Oz. It was a Friday afternoon, and many had come directly from the Manhattan offices, shedding their suit coats and ties for something more festive, as we waited for the ferry to dock at the pier. Once we were on board, the cork was out of the bottle, and everyone was getting more campy by the minute and by the drink, as this magic bark skipped the waters to a precious few days on Fantasy Island. I remember looking around and feeling somewhat sorry for the few straight people off to themselves in the corner of the vessel, but then I thought, that's how we're made to feel every day, everywhere. The other peculiarity was the quantity and variety of luggage that accompanied these refugees from normalcy, who were only venturing out for a weekend, or maybe a 2-week escape at best. As we hurried to disembark, a bag belonging to a particularly straight-looking voyager got bumped into the water. A collective "Aww" went up as we crooked our necks to watch the sack sink forever into the murky deep. Moments later, this was followed by a howl of laughter as a huge bright pink powder puff arose to the surface as the owner's face turned an even more shocking shade of scarlet. Now my feet were on terra firma, and nothing could be expected to be the same on this hollowed ground. First of all, there were no roads and consequently no cars. A spider web of narrow wooden boardwalks linked us from here to everywhere else. We were met by a line of little wagons, like we had as children, that were available to pull your luggage, groceries, or inebriated partner to anywhere you had to go. Louis, of course, knew his way around and led me to the hub of the web and down a walk to the guest house where he had reserved a room for the next few days. Everything was quaint and cozy, and gay as a picnic basket. We explored the maze of walkways and looked into the tiny shops that were poked in here and there. After a drink, we had a pleasant supper at a restaurant named The Monster, and then as night fell, a few more drinks at one of the bars, watching the boys of whatever age dance the night away. Neither of us was interested in late nights, so that we could be up bright and early and out on the beach to catch the sunrise over the water to the east. At the end of the day, we could watch it set westward where Manhattan lay hidden. It was one of the most spectacular beaches on the eastern seaboard, with fine white sand, miles to walk, as long as we only wanted to walk east or west. The cluster of diminutive buildings that comprised Cherry Grove was an assortment of irregularly arranged bungalows, shacks, shops, guest houses, restaurants, and bars, all constructed on stilts over the sand and connected by this web of raised wooden walks. At either end was a walkway that led elsewhere. To the east was a more upscale straight community called the Fire Island Pines, or just the Pines, and to the west, I do not really know. Come Sunday morning, I found out there was a mass celebrated at the Pines in a restaurant. Cleared the tables for the occasion. I found an uneasy mix of straight Pines folk, mostly over-tanned older women, and a range of gay younger men who, like myself, had made the pilgrimage over the sands from the Grove. This 4-day foray on Fantasy Island was the first time Louis and I had ever had an opportunity to spend any time alone together, relax, talk, and get to know each other on a deeper level. I try to remember as a beautiful breather from the crazy, wonderful, chaotic, suit-covered life in Manhattan. Incomplete sentence. But it was over soon enough, and Louis drove back to his own reality with Doris and the 4 little ones after dropping me back at my second-floor pied-à-terre on East 96th Street. And I grew to love my neighborhood, and I got to know the stores and shops around me, taking in the look and feel of it all. At my corner was a local subway stop, 96th Street on the Lexington Avenue line. One stop south was 86th Street, stop where I could change for the express train, heading further south. Or I go north to the 125th Street stop and continue on up to the Bronx, or exit and catch the elevated New Haven Railroad up to Connecticut. But mostly I walked down to 86th Street, which was the hub of a once thriving German neighborhood. There I could enjoy the remaining German restaurants and pastry shops, where I could have slices of wonderful German torts, a confectionery shop with an array of chocolate-dipped candies, and little delicately colored animals, fruits, and vegetables handcrafted from marzipan. There were European delicatessens and butcher shops, coffee shops, and my favorite, a long, narrow diner-type eatery that made real German potato pancakes with homemade applesauce, as good as my Aunt Madeline's ever were. On the corner of 86th and Lexington was Wright's, an American-type coffee shop, and a restaurant that was open all night. It was my favorite place to hang out over a cup of coffee on the long counter and visit with friends. I'd often meet up with Louie's good friend Bill, who knew the old waitress by name. He had introduced me to all of them, and soon they called me by my name. He and I would discuss my latest trials or the worries of the world, and he, in hushed tones, if the subject matter might give way, what kind of guys we were. I had figured out early on that what these old girls did not know could be written on the back of a paper napkin. But Bill was of a different generation, so I would go along with it. Often other guys of his age from the neighborhood would stop by and join us, and soon I got to know all of them. One Friday after work, I decided to put a fresh coat of varnish on the wood floor of my apartment. I started at the far end and painted my way out of the door into the hallway. All I had to do was lock up and stay out for several hours until it was dry enough to go back in. In those days, when out in public on city streets, we did not customarily dress like refugees. If not in a suit, we would at least wear slacks and a decent jacket. But I had just painted my way out the door and was now out in blue jeans and work shoes, topped off with a rough gray herringbone pullover with black wool sleeves and collar that I had fashioned myself out of scraps from work. It was a warmish autumn night, so I figured I would walk down 3rd Avenue all the way around 51st Street, then up to Lexington Avenue, pop into Wright's on 86th, and finally go home. I made my way downtown, looking into the myriad of fascinating shops along the avenue and hoping I would not run into anyone I knew because of the way I was attired. I stopped into the corner coffee shop over the subway entrance at 51st Street and 3rd Ave and observed the game going on out on the street. It was not much more than a year ago when I was here and had not a clue to what kind of trade was being plied around here, but now I was older and wiser. Ha! I smirked to myself, dressed as I was. I could be taken for rough trade. I figured I would cross over to Lexington Avenue on 57th Street because it was better lighted with cafes and shop windows. As I slowly made my way back up 3rd Avenue, the street-worn younger men gave me their familiar hard looks from shadows of the doorways that they lurked in. I returned their looks in kind, since I now knew the name of the game. In the darkened shop windows, I was able to catch the reflection of the interested clients who briefly paused to see if I would look up and make eye contact with them. I also became aware of the sedans with New Jersey plates slowly circling the block, peering from the passenger side window to see if they had made eye contact. If that then did happen, I observed how the driver would pull over close to the curb, and the vendor would quickly slip in, and off they would go. Sometimes it was several trips around the block to establish contact, and if the driver was cautious, he would pull around the corner on the dark side of the street to make the pickup. This brought me back to the question, why were older men expected to pay younger ones for the pleasure of their company? This was left hanging since that last time I was around here, when that John on foot propositioned me with money, thinking that I was the new boy on the block. As I slowly walked, I noticed a car which had twice circled the block and was now moving at the same slow pace as I was. As I approached the corner, my pursuer put on his right turn signal, and then turned down 53rd Street for about a quarter of a block and halted. I suddenly realized that this was my opportunity to have my question answered. The sedan had Jersey plates, so it was probably not a vice cop. As I approached the car, I figured that I would go along with this just up to the point of the exchange of cash for services. How much for rough trade? Then I would see if I could engage him in conversation with my question. Margaret Mead would have nothing on me. He was waiting, flipped open the passenger door and said, "Hop in," and off we went. I caught a quick glimpse of him as the car passed under a streetlight. "Not too bad. I've done worse." He said he had a place right around here, which surprised me. He drove a few blocks to around 57th Street and First Ave, parked, and entered the lobby of a modern 50s building, took the elevator up a few floors and into a small, neat one-bedroom apartment that did not look lived in very much. He offered me a drink, scotch, and we sat down on opposite sides of a small sofa with large modern glass-top coffee table in front of it. He said a few words as we sipped our drinks. I studied him. Middle age, medium build, soft face, with navy light brown thinning hair. Not bad looking. He was definitely someone's husband from a suburban New Jersey. But why the apartment here, I wondered. He then slid some folded bills over to my end of the table and said nervously, "Is that okay?" I squinted at the money in the dim light. Maybe 2 or 3 20s. I figured, yeah, that'll do. But first I got a question. He furrowed his brow and said, "Yeah, what?" "Why? Why do men like you think you have to pay money to guys like me?" With that, I slid the bills back to him. After a pause, he leaned over toward me with his hands clasped and said, "What are you up to?" So I told him, and we began to talk. Obviously, the sexual spell was broken, but I had piqued his interest. He fixed another drink, and we eventually stretched out on the bed in the other room to continue our conversation into the night. Yes, he was married for a long time, still loved his wife, 2 kids off to college, responsible position in Manhattan, and an occasional but strong desire to be with another man. This place kept all that separated from his home life. And the money? Well, that way he had no obligation to the other guy, physically, emotionally, socially, or any other way. Just like in business, you buy what you want, you pay for it, and you have no further responsibility or guilt. It had gotten late, and he insisted that I at least take some money for a taxi ride home. I agreed, and I caught a cab to my door. When I got in, the floor was dry, and I had the answer to my question. Well, sort of. I never got his name, and he never asked mine. I'll take a break there.